I'm Evan Feigenbaum, the Vice President for Asia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And this is one chapter in a video series on 6 crises and how the United States and China, despite their very considerable and deep strategic rivalry, nonetheless managed to coordinate. We're talking this time to John Podesta, who served as the White House Chief of Staff for President Bill Clinton, and later played a major role in climate change diplomacy between the United States and China. First, as the president of the Center for American Progress, a think tank that deeply influenced the Obama administration's thinking, and later inside the administration as counselor to the president. In 2013, the US-China relationship was becoming increasingly tense because of high-level security provocations. For example, the Chinese decision to announce an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. That was viewed as a provocation in Washington and Tokyo and significantly ratcheted up security tensions. But that year, Presidents Xi and Obama also reached a major climate-related agreement to regulate the production and consumption of hydrofluorocarbons, which are chemicals used in refrigerants and air conditioners that are thousands of times more potent than carbon dioxide. And what's more, the two countries agreed to press third countries, including holdouts like India, for example, to also adjust their own HFC policies. We asked John Podesta a little bit about that experience, about what worked between the United States and China and what didn't, what was hard, what was easy, and whether there are any lessons from that experience that might apply today as Washington and Beijing try to navigate their way through the coronavirus crisis caused by COVID-19. And here's what he told us.
Well, there's a saga behind this. There was a fair amount of attention leading up to Copenhagen and then coming out of Copenhagen on what were referred to as short-lived climate pollutants. And the bulk of the attention was on a couple of other different pollutants, black carbon and methane. But at CAP, we focused on the potential to phase down what we viewed as super polluting hydrofluorocarbons. And so we paid a lot of attention to that because it had the potential to reduce global average temperatures by 0.5 degrees C by the end of the century. Fast forward into 2013. President Obama has come through re-election. On election night, puts climate change front and center on his second term agenda. Dennis McDonough was appointed chief of staff. He engaged in a series of conversations with a few of us from the outside about how to move the climate agenda forward. And simultaneously, President Xi was going to visit the United States in what became the Sunnylands meeting. Xi had been to the United States before as vice president, but was coming now as president and you know the person in charge of both the party and the government. And in one of those early meetings in 2013, I suggested to Dennis that a place where they might find some common ground was to phase down the production and use of hydrofluorocarbons. It was important for the world. It was important for both countries. It was a place where the Chinese position wasn't as locked in as it was on some other things, where there was a potential for collaboration. And we knew all that because we had been involved in an extensive Track 2 dialogue with the Chinese and with Chinese leaders in the scientific community and in the climate community for several years at CAP. And Dennis picked that idea up and kind of ran with it. Talked to our chief negotiator at the State Department, Todd Stern, who began a dialogue with his counterpart. HFCs was sort of on the agenda, but at the end of a long agenda, all of a sudden it rose to the top. And it was one of the things that President Obama indicated to President Xi that he wanted to talk to him about at what was really a kind of get to know you meeting in Sunnylands. It was a very broad agenda. They had a lot of time to just talk kind of one-on-one and in small group conversations. But as it turned out, it was the one clear deliverable that came out of that meeting, which was the two leaders, to the surprise of the world, agreed that in order to find a way to get on a track that both countries could deliver a global public good, as it were, they would work to, through the Montreal Protocol, phase down these super polluting chemicals that are used in refrigeration. And I think people were surprised by it. It kind of came out of the blue for most people. But it ended up being a place, and the climate conversation became a place that Obama and Xi came back to as a place of cooperation, even as there was friction growing in the relationship rather than subsiding. There were both in the security domain and in the commercial domains, there was a lot of friction around stealing intellectual property, etc. But this was a place where they could show that for the good of the world, they could kind of find a track to cooperate in. It began with HFCs. It culminated in the joint statement in Beijing in the lead up to Paris, and then culminated in the Paris Agreement itself, the broader effort to attack climate change. It was clear that the two biggest economies were going to have to drive consensus on climate change. But in the first term, the Chinese position remained, we're a developing country. You know, you hear the talking points from the Chinese. You're a developed country. We're taking our people out of poverty. You're the historical greatest emitter. China was rapidly rising on that scale and took over as the world's largest emitter. Now is significantly the world's largest emitter. But still, the old talking points were on the table, and the negotiations were leading up to Copenhagen were fraught with sort of finger pointing and China trying to claim that it was representing the developing world when really it had become an industrialized nation and a major emitter, and then the world's largest emitter. It had already passed the EU at that point, and then passed the United States. But the dialogue was still one of contention and division. In Copenhagen, there was this dramatic meeting that in which President Obama, Secretary Clinton broke into a meeting of China, India, I think Brazil. I wasn't at the meeting. I'm on the outside of the government. I can't remember exactly. I think there was a fourth player there, maybe South Africa. And the structure of Paris is really born in that meeting. But it was a hot meeting with a lot of finger pointing, particularly between the Chinese side and the American side, with the Chinese negotiators lecturing the president pushing back. But what emerged from that was the decision to change the architecture of, in essence, how the world would come together on a global instrument towards what ultimately became the Paris Agreement. And that was that each individual country had its own circumstance, its own politics, and that building a bottom-up structure rather than a top-down structure was going to work better. So that this idea that nationally determined commitments would be the underpinning of a global system really was born in that Copenhagen meeting, and born between the really fractious relationship between the US and China. But I think coming out of it, it set up the idea that indeed we've got to get on a better path, a stronger path. I think the Chinese also realized in that period, that was in and that was in the first term, they realized that they were all of a sudden becoming the bad guy. They were no longer the representative of the developing world that ironically contribute the least to the global warming problem, but are clobbered the most. The people with the least emissions face devastating consequences from the long-term effects of climate change on food security, human security, etc. And the Chinese tried to hold themselves out as the protector of those interests, and all of a sudden things turned around on them in the Copenhagen meeting at the end of 2010. And people were saying, wait a minute, you're now the biggest polluter in the world. So it changed for them. They realized they needed to change for their soft power purposes, their attitude. And the ice began to break, and it led to the ability of China and the US to find a path forward on climate change. But I think the first concrete result, as I was saying, goes back to that Sunnylands meeting where Obama put that on the table with Xi. The concrete result of that was this agreement. Kigali actually took place after Paris, but it began to build. There began to build trust between the negotiators, and it wasn't to say that there weren't long, tough meetings, largely between our chief negotiators, led by Todd Stern, and Xie Zhenyuan, the Chinese side. But then when I joined the Obama administration, Secretary Kerry, I got in the act. We had, long, very difficult sessions with them, but we found a way forward. And, I think that what's kind of interesting is that Obama picked up on what was probably viewed by most people as, as a, secondary lane, if you will. It was important. Half a degree C is big, but it was a secondary lane. But it was one where there was just less friction at the moment, and he knew he had the idea that you could build from a position where if you got cooperation on one thing, you could build out cooperation on a more global solution to the climate crisis. I would say two things. One is that the number of places of friction were actually probably at the stage of increasing. Xi had just come into office. He was consolidating power. He was pushing out his enemies. He was doing things that were, I think, contrary to the general the general thrust of Chinese policy that goes back to my days with President Clinton when we were, dealing with WTO accession, et cetera. So things were actually going in many ways in a more, the level of friction was going up. It was going up in the East China Sea. It was going up in the South China Sea. It was going up in the commercial relationship. The theft of intellectual property became an important issue. Human rights space was closing rather than opening, and so a lot of the I guess I would refer to it as, and I've gone back to look at President Clinton's speech when we were doing the WTO piece. I think no one really was naive about the fact that China had choices to make, but that binding them into an international system meant they were more likely to make better choices than worse choices. But there were always elements that were fraught with difficulty, friction, again, in the economic space, in the commercial space, in the security space and in the human rights space. And you just had to stay at it, work through it. But where I think the question of trust came up was, I do think that it was hard to get commitments from the Chinese on the places of friction. But at least in my experience, when they made commitments, they followed through on them. And I think that that was President Obama's experience as well. That the relationship between Xi and Obama wasn't one of best friends. It was one of people who were leaders of their respective countries, that you had to be open and honest in the dialogue, and hopefully state with, clarity where you wanted to see change, and when they agreed to make change, make sure that there was follow through. And I think in that experience, the trust was mostly around that question. If they made a commitment, would they keep it? And vice versa. And I think that that's what Obama was, I think, in that sense, trying to shape the behavior, but ultimately it was their decision that was really what was going to matter to the long-term future of the world, and certainly of the China and the United States relationship. Well, I think that in negotiations with the Chinese, they always start with a maximalist position. And you always have to sort of say that we both know that's not your real position, so let's get to it. And I think that the quicker you can get to a real conversation and test the boundaries of where they really is their kind of red line, the quicker you're going to get to some decent resolution. In the HFC case, kind of moving up to that Sunnylands meeting, the Chinese position was that they wanted they were willing to talk about phasing down HFCs, but they wanted to do that in the context of the UNFCCC process. The US position was, we have a vehicle, the Montreal Protocol. It's proven to work on CFCs, a kind of a predecessor chemical, and to some extent, HFCs became a substitute for CFCs and created a different problem. And we know that mechanism works. We know it can be binding, and we know how to apply it, and we know that that's the quickest route to a global phase down of the chemicals. And the negotiators wouldn't agree. I think our State Department negotiators said, fine, we'll let the leaders resolve it. Well, from the Chinese side, that's the worst threat you could imagine, that they would go into a meeting with like an open item that would be in a one-on-one meeting between the President of the United States and the President of China, that they would resolve that in, taking a walk around, the desert at Sunnylands. And so they've, I think that was a good negotiating strategy on the U.S. side, and they said no, okay, we'll try to come to the meeting with the president brief so that they can have a serious discussion and we can live with that Montreal Protocol vehicle. Years later, that finally culminated in a global agreement, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which is now in place. U.S. still hasn't ratified it. That's sort of bewildering because U.S. business is for it. Republicans on the Hill are for it, but the Trump administration has resisted sending it up for ratification. although it appears to be ideological. It's not a little unclear. Maybe it's because it was negotiated in Obama's administration or whatever. But I think we're on track. It's being implemented. Countries are moving along. Alternative chemicals are being developed. In the climate space, I think there were breakthroughs that occurred. Again, now we're fast forward a year. Secretary Kerry had the idea of trying to press the Chinese to have the two presidents come to some agreement in advance of Paris, and trying to move forward with what that might look like to give a signal to the world that a global agreement was possible. That set off a round of exchanges, a round of negotiations between myself at the White House, Secretary Kerry, and Ambassador Stern at the State Department with the Chinese, back and forth, either on video teleconference or in person, over the course of 2014. The biggest thing I think that was challenging was for the Chinese was to come to terms with the idea that there was a way forward on the question that really stems back to the original UN agreement on climate change that goes back to the first Bush administration, which is, what does common and differentiated commitment mean in the context of climate change? And we were able, through long, difficult negotiations, to find our way to language that was acceptable to both sides, that brought the Chinese into a regime where their commitments were quite substantial. There's confusion about that, but their commitment that they made with, and in this joint announcement where President Obama and President Xi jointly announced the US and the Chinese position going into Paris a year before Paris in Beijing, committed the Chinese to build out as much renewable energy as existed in their entire energy system in China at that time. That's a lot of clean energy. And it was working through those, you might even think of them as sort of ideological position details, and getting practical and getting down to the commitments. We had a very good understanding of what their system could do. I think they had a pretty good understanding of what our system could do. Spent a lot of time at the technical level, but mostly it was the political commitment of both leaders to say this was important to our bilateral relationship, but it was really important to jumpstart really the global negotiation. And that's indeed what happened. We had a bilateral meeting. The president had a bilateral meeting with Xi in the wake of the APEC meeting in Beijing in the fall of 2014. Stunned the world because both commitments were substantial, and that really led to a sense that, unlike Copenhagen, where things kind of never really came together and we got the kind of second best at the end, that there was a possibility that the globe could come into a harmonized regime that would not solve the problem by any means, but would create a framework for increased ambition that would ratchet up over the years. The most important lesson is that there are gonna be areas of competition and in a non-hard power sense, real conflict. And I think that the most important approach that a president, I think, needs to take is to be clear about where your priorities are, to not give up on the areas of friction, to keep pressing the case for change, to use both carrots and sticks, to not be afraid to use whatever you have in your arsenal to push back and punish bad behavior, to always keep your values in front of you, but to always understand that's not 100 or it's not a zero-sum game. You have to have areas where you're going to pursue places of common interest, and whether that's counterterrorism, whether that's climate change, whether it's other areas of that where you can have places where you can have win-win situations. You have to keep those channels open, and you can't decide, if I can't get resolution here, then I'm not talking here, here, and here. If the overall relationship breaks down, I think the world is in a bad place, because if you think of the global challenges, the pandemic we're in, the questions of climate change, proliferation, violent extremism, mass human migration. If you don't have some level of dialogue, coordination, and collaboration, then I think we're gonna end up in a bad place. Bad place for China, bad place for the U.S., bad place for the world. So I think that the hardest part is to keep that honesty going, where you can punch where you need to punch, but cooperate where you need to cooperate. And in that period of 2014, as we were running up to the question of climate, the Ebola crisis hit in the summer of particularly in August. The first cases of Ebola, I think, occurred in late 2013, but it was fairly isolated, cross-border, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, and it was a problem that people were looking at, but it really, during the summer of 2014, became what became a crisis. And you've interviewed Susan Rice, so Ambassador Rice probably has told you the story, but we were headed into a period where the attention of the U.S. government and the attention of the president was coming to grips with that crisis in West Africa. And the UN General Assembly meetings were coming up. The Chinese were sending the number 3 person in the Chinese structure, Zhang Guoli, who was the executive vice premier. President Xi, I think, generally doesn't come to the UN General Assembly, but certainly didn't come that year. And the Chinese requested a meeting between the president and Zhang Guoli. I think for 2 reasons. That was an unusual request. The president usually meets with heads of state when he's there. His time's in great demand. He does only, a half a dozen meetings, probably at the most, one-on-one. And I think for 2 reasons, after consultations in the White House amongst the senior leaders there, we recommended that the president take that meeting. And the 2 reasons were we needed to press forward on trying to get increased ambition from the Chinese on climate, and in the run-up to Paris, and in that joint statement, which occurred a couple months later. But the United States also wanted to press the Chinese to do more on Ebola, to deploy their assets to the region. And I'm sure she's given a more complete story about that. So the president decided that he would do a bilateral meeting, press the case. It turned out, as it turned out, Zhang Guoli was in charge both of and was a member of the standing committee and was essentially the point person on deciding what the Chinese offer would be in Paris. He was the first line that needed to be, socialized inside the standing committee. But he was the point person on that. He also was the point person on the global health response, and so they had a very candid meeting about that. The Chinese had not responded to the world call, but he made a commitment to amp up the report. Then Susan took it from there, and the Chinese did come forward. So it showed that, I think what that story really tells is that if you at least have some open source of trying to find cooperation, you could add to that. You could tack some things on. Doesn't mean you're not going to be fighting about other things. And we were fighting about other things up through and during the duration of the Obama administration. But having that open channel, I think, opened up the opportunity to press the case. I went back to China after that. We kept on them to provide through all of our channels, through Secretary Kerry, through Susan's direct diplomacy, both in the U.S. and in Beijing, and then in the president's visit when he went to China, that they had to stay on top of this. They had an obligation to the world, and I think it was an example that after these other what were challenges for the Chinese system, SARS, MERS, etc., there was the opportunity to find better systems of disclosure of information, common ground about problem assessment, ability to surge against a problem. And I think that broke down a little bit, both in terms of the information that the Chinese released at the front end of the coronavirus crisis, and then I think we didn't really have, if you will, boots on the ground. We withdrew our assets early on from China, and the people we had in Wuhan were evacuated. And there was sort of a blindness on the US side. Now we were getting reports, everybody was looking at what was going on in social media. Other countries were responding. The Taiwanese jumped on it. A quicker response in South Korea. They had been through more, I think, crisis management during SARS that never affected the U.S. as much. You know, it came to North America, but it never affected the U.S. as much. But that the kind of breakdown of the higher level dialogue, I think, meant that we had a slower response at the front end, and now we have, you know, the presidents are talking, but I think we don't have the level of collaboration and cooperation that you might think is optimal. Look, we're in a global kind of soft power competition. I'm afraid we're losing. You know, America's still projecting America first, while the Chinese are surging medical supplies into Europe. They're running a disinformation campaign or an information campaign. I think it's mostly a disinformation campaign about what we're doing, what the lack of U.S. response has been, the flaws of the current American response, and how they're trying to be global good guys. And the administration, on the other hand, is like trying to buy German companies to get exclusive uh, uh, supply chains to apply against America. So yeah, we're in global competition on the soft power side, but I think we're kind of losing. And instead, I think what needs to happen is not a bilateral response necessarily, but a multilateral response that is clear about the global threat, that exercises global responsibility. And in this case, I think we can take a page from the global scientific community, who are tearing down borders, who are talking to each other, who are not hoarding information in hopes that they'll win the Nobel Prize, but releasing it sometimes before it's in a peer-reviewed journal, just so that people can jump on it as fast as they can and stay in dialogue to find the best solutions to what is a global pandemic. If this is not a time for global solidarity and cooperation and open communication, I don't know what is. And, you know, instead we're sort of playing games. I think that largely is for not as a global security strategy. I don't think we're making any friends in Australia or Italy or, you know, the Netherlands by what Pompeo's doing. I think it's a domestic strategy to sort of deflect blame for the long gap between the knowledge that a pandemic was on the horizon and the response from the US government. And I think that there were people inside the US government who were signaling this, both in the intelligence community and CDC and other places, Tony Fauci and others. But I think the administration was very slow to take this as a crisis. And I think this is a way of deflecting blame for that by somehow pretending that even though other countries were acting, even though our intelligence agencies were screaming, even though our public health agencies were worried, the administration wasted a couple of months. The easy fall guy for that is to say, you know, the Chinese lied about it. And they did, you know, there's a thread of truth in that. They were slow to produce the information. It didn't come, I think, from the region up to the national government. The national government didn't publish it as quickly as they could have and should have. And the coordination with the WHO lagged. But that was, you know, in December and early January, and we remained kind of asleep at the switch from January to March. And I think it's the governor's fault. It's the nurses' fault for hoarding masks, and now it's the Chinese fault. So you asked me for my advice. My advice is watch the scientists in the domestic response, but watch the scientists in the international response as well. Watch them break down their barriers, cooperate, collaborate, talk to each other, research together, try to find cures together, and model that behavior in the global security dimension.